question.
Definitely not our kingdom. Look at all of you awesome people on the chats. T-Bird, Team Collier, Isaac McKenzie, Anika, Marin Frew, Anika again, Ollie and Edna, Elvis, Stavey Wood, he's about to have his 30th birthday this week on youth on Thursday night. Is that right? 30 I think, which is pretty awesome. Oh, Rue and Nat, shaka shalom to you. It's good to see all of you. Well, as we're getting ready for leaders meeting, I just had quite a few different things on my heart, and I know Katie's already said it, but I just want to reinforce it. We're so thankful for all of our awesome leaders. We're thankful for you. Honestly, everything that Curate is able to do because of you. You are the releases. You're also the capacity that we have to disciple people well. And so we just want to thank you. Thank you for all of the time you spend with people. Thank you for the time you spend with God. Thank you for all the sacrifices you make, because it's making a difference. And we've seen just through the years that, as Katie was saying, the number of leaders determines our capacity for kingdom impact, but also so does the depth of our leaders determines the capacity for kingdom impact. And our hope is through these leaders meetings and the different things we do to help invest in you, that we're able to just grow your depth as well as our breadth as leaders. And we know when that happens, there's greater kingdom impact. If you can lead 3 people well, that's amazing. But if we can help you lead 5 people well, man, that's greater kingdom impact. If we can help you lead 10 people well, that's greater kingdom impact. If we can help you raise up another leader yourself, that's a multiplication of kingdom impact. And that is our hope. Yes, I see you on the chat, Sandro. Youth. All the youth leaders just filling up the chat. How's the Pankhurst? It's good to see the Auckland Morgans. We got everybody on there. It's so great. Canis, good to see you down as keen as. That's good. Stokesy, yes. Oh, all of us. Miss your drumming. Okay, here we all are. The team chose the topic leading in, what was it? Leading in COVID, in conspiracies, and in chaos. So I hope you're ready for tonight's sort of deposit. I've been doing lots of prep for this. I've just spent the last little bit of time away actually trying to finalize my prep and really make sure I'm given something that is worthy of all of the time that you've taken out tonight. And so I know we're going to have some fun together. I want to remind you that leading is so good. Leading's so good. When we choose to lead, that is how God accomplishes the good He wants to see happen in this world. We partner with Him when we lead in making all things new, in His kingdom coming to earth. And if you think over the course of human history, if you can look at any major social impact, any time a person's life has ever been changed, you will see that there was a leader at its source. And so that's why us leading is so good. It accomplishes so good. Nothing good happens without people leading. And so thank you once again for leading. There's a story in the book of Judges, and it's about a guy named Jephthah. And it's in Judges 11, and he was a mighty man who was raised up, but then the nation of Israel actually shunned him and sent him away into exile. It was a time of peace, and this was a mighty leader, and they didn't have need for a mighty leader, but seasons changed, and the nation came under threat. And during that time, what happened is the sort of elders of Israel realized that they needed a leader exactly like Jephthah, but they had sent him away. And so they actually went and called him and asked him to be their leader. And I want to say, in times like this, even though it might not be that leaders maybe have been pushed away, or maybe we haven't seen the value always in leadership, it's times like this that we need leadership more than ever. And you might feel like, man, maybe you haven't always been valued, maybe you haven't always understood leadership, but I really just want to affirm that you have been created for such a time as this. Our paths have crossed for such a time as this. You are a part of this church for such a time as this, and we need you. We need to call you back in and go, this is a time for you to rise up and be a leader and be the mighty leader that you were called to be. Leading in COVID, in conspiracies, and in chaos. I think we need to appreciate at the moment that leading's tough. In fact, not only is leading tough, just doing life can seem tough at times like this. And also being a Christian in today's environment is increasingly challenging and has challenges that perhaps 10 years didn't exist the same way 10 years ago, or maybe 20 years ago, that things are changing, and sometimes we can struggle to wrap our head around or understand what's going on, so then we can understand how to not just follow Jesus in it, but also how to lead within it. And so what I want to do tonight is hopefully give us some level of understanding about all of this stuff, so we can have an understanding more of what's going on around us, so we can figure out how to follow Jesus in it, but also lead others to follow Jesus well in this season. So we're going to talk about a bunch of different stuff that's going on around us, and some of it is not just going on around us, it's going on in us, and so we need to become aware of it. The first thing I want to talk about is that we need to acknowledge our society is regressive. We live in a regressive society. I know we call it a progressive society, then we think all of the different laws and all of our different ways of being are progressive, that we're progressing somewhere. But if you look at the true measures of human health, we're actually regressive. We're becoming emotionally more unhealthy as a society. The breakdown of the family, the breakdown of people's well-being, the breakdown of a sense of purpose and meaning in people's lives. I mean, societies where people tragically take their own lives en masse is not a healthy place to be. We live in a regressive society. And actually, my good friend here, this is a great book. He's not my friend, no, he is because I read his books, but Edwin Friedman, I would recommend this book, The Failure of Nerve. He talks about how regressive societies actually have these marker points. They are reactive. That is, that they're in a vicious cycle of intense reacting, and we can see that in our society. Nobody's listening, we're just reacting to each other. Herding, but not herding to strength. We adapt to the least mature members. That actually society is dragged down in its group empathy to its least mature members, and that determines the level of health. The third marker would be blame displacement, that there's a focus on the forces that affect us rather than on personal responsibility. And there's a quick fix mentality. There's a low threshold for pain. Actually, what people are seeking is relief rather than change. And you can see that in our political tendencies. You can see that in what we demand of leaders, of people around us. But we just need to acknowledge that we live in a regressive society, not a progressive society. And that affects everything around us, the emotional health of the systems around us. The second thing is we live in a tribal time, that this is a time of political polarization, where everybody is wanting you to fit into a box, to pick an issue, to pick a side, to decide if you're left or if you're right, or what your ideology is. In this tribal idea, we identify with groups, we belong to groups, we're easily offended. There's little to no listening. We're hypersensitive. And we need to be aware of this because Richard Rohr, the mystic, he actually said it like this: it's easier to belong to a group than to belong to God. And sometimes we can be sucked into that as followers of Jesus and leaders, where we can identify with these tribal identities, if you would, rather than where we should really be identifying. So I just want us to keep that in mind. That tribalism causes division. It's actually pulling us apart. And I think we need to remember Augustine, he's a great church father, and he wrote this very, very famous line. He said, in essentials, unity, speaking of the Christian creeds, and in non-essentials, liberty, and in all things, love. And in a time like this, we need to not be dragged into the tribalism, but need to bind together in love. The third thing that's going on around us at the moment is loneliness. The epidemic of loneliness. The epidemic of loneliness has been building up steam for about 80 years in the West. It can be linked to the breakdown of family values, the breakdown of the nuclear family. It can be linked to the lack of intergenerational relationships, the fact that people live outside of local and small communities. It can be linked to the rise of affluence and where people no longer need to depend on each other anymore. They normally end up going off on their own, and over time, if we're not careful, we end up being lonely. Globalization contributes to loneliness. Because people move all over the world and they find themselves distant from their roots. And I'm not saying these things are good or bad. I'm just saying they contribute to the sense of loneliness. Cities are lonelier than rural communities, and more people live in cities than ever. And so there's this loneliness continuing to grow. In fact, they say that over a quarter of the population in the West is lonely. That's crazy. We're surrounded by people, but we're lonely. The next thing going on around us, just in case it's like not overwhelming enough, is there's a sentiment that the overwhelming culture identifies with this idea of victimhood. We live in a victimhood culture. It's an outward focus rather than an inward focus. We're quick to blame for one's own emotional response. How we interact with the world is not often our fault. It's blamed on our environment. It's blamed on inequalities of the past. It's blamed on these other factors. And I'm not saying they don't matter, but we're in a time of victimhood, of taking very little responsibility, no responsibility. It's all about rights, no responsibilities. And while outside factors, of course, play a part, what we know psychologically, what we know scripturally, is that actually while outside things play a part, it's actually our internal response that is the ultimate determiner of what our lives end up looking like. And so resiliency and these ideas, but we live in a victimhood culture. We see it every time a sports team, the Warriors again, horrible season. Shout out to the Warriors fans. But it's like straight away, it's like we call for another coach. Well, we've had like 20 coaches and we're still not a winning team. And so it's this idea of we want to blame somebody. And I know leadership has its place, but there's more people in leadership in a club than just the coach. And there's a whole thing going on there, but we want someone to blame rather than take responsibility. We see it in businesses. We see it in politics. Gosh, we see it in marriage. Anyone that wakes up one day and says they have a bad marriage never really thinks first that it's their fault. We always think it's the other person's fault. And that's this propensity to see ourselves as a victim. The next thing that's going on in our world is we have an obsession with safety. An obsession with safety. Leaders are afraid of being blamed, so safety has become the highest value. There will be, actually I want to read what what Edwin says in this book, in The Failure of Nerve. He says, this focus on safety has become so omnipresent in our chronically anxious civilization that there is a real danger we will come to believe that safety is the most important value in life. It is certainly important as a modifier of other initiatives, but if a society is to evolve or if leaders are to arise, then safety can never be allowed to become more important than adventure. Don't you love that? Safety can never become more important than adventure. We are on our way to becoming a nation of skimmers, living off the risks of previous generations and constantly taking from the top without significantly adding to its essence. Everything we enjoy as a part of our advanced civilization, including the discovery, exploration, and development of our country, came about because previous generations made adventure more important than safety. Gosh, we live in this coddled society. It's why so much of the stuff going on around COVID, you can see, and I'm not going to get into that right now, but it's just like you can see that the higher value is safety above all else. And so the decisions are made and leaders don't want to be blamed. So everybody is making very safety conscious decisions. And I'm not commenting on whether it's right or wrong. I'm just observing the overall climate that we are in. We can continue on as if we're not only just getting warmed up, I've got more. There's little to no respect for leadership. I mean, I talked about the need for honor a couple of weeks ago in Church Online, but cynicism and distrust of authority run ripe in our society. We're a society of armchair experts. I don't know how many of you have Googled and told me that you've got all the info on, vaccines and different things, but we're armchair experts. And I know people are going to hate me saying that, but I'm sick of the Google expert. I want to hear from the medical professionals and not see. Anyway, I shouldn't be doing it. Anyway, we'll move on. Cynicism, armchair experts, we desire leaders to empathize with us rather than lead us. We want leaders to soothe us rather than challenge us. We want peace rather than progress. And many of us want a counselor rather than a leader. We live in a leaderless time because we don't know how to honor and respect authority in these ways. And this reactivity, it wears down leaders. And it makes people, and I'm sure like many of you have thought, I can't be bothered leading in this. I'm afraid to even say anything. I was talking with a bunch of pastors the other day and they said, well, maybe we should all just go and sell ice cream because nobody ever has anything bad to say about someone who sells ice cream. It feels like it's the only safe vocation you could have these days. And I can understand why there aren't leaders, because you get more of what you honor, and when you don't honor it, we don't have it. We live in a complex world, and it's important to understand that. It's not just complicated, it's complex. It's like complicated squared. It's complicated on complicated. We're hyper-connected. It's sophisticated. The problems in the world are not easily solvable. The more data we have, the more information we have, the more we just tear our hair out to go, what could you do about this? I mean, you only have to look at the shipping problems in the world, and they don't think it's going to right itself for years and years to come because the systems are so complex now, and we live in this complexity. We live in a culture that's hyper aware of injustice. We have a culture of virtual signaling where we say more about it, or we posture ourselves about it, or we want to look like we're sort of like fans or supporters of certain things, even though we may have never done anything significant to help people ever in our lives. It's like the time of public apologies where people get up and they apologize for things, but whether or not they mean it, we have no real idea. It's easy to apologize for something somebody else did, a lot harder when it's something you did. We have very little appreciation for the effects of sin on our world, and I think that people honestly believe that people are inherently good, and if only all the environmental factors would be solved around their lives, that they would do good things. But human history proves that every human heart has the problem of sin. And even if you get all the environmental factors right, you still get people who use and abuse other people. There are deeper issues in the area of injustice. And I'm not saying that inequality isn't a big issue. Don't misunderstand me. It is a big issue. And as a church, we are here to do our part in making wrong things right. But in this world where we're hyper aware of it, but we're not hyper aware of the core issue, we end up a bit lost and we can become social warrior justice without Jesus. We live in a time of moral relativism where there's no right or wrong. As long as you're happy, as long as you're not hurting anyone, go for it. And then we have our Christian versions of that where we say, well, God just loves everybody, doesn't he? As if his holiness or these other things have nothing to do with it. Even we justify crime if it's in the cause of the right thing. And there's just been this big movement over the last 150 years where people maybe looked at Scripture as the basis for ethics and morals. And then we looked at science as the basis for ethics and morals. And now we just look at self. We just look inward. And that doesn't really work. And then we even have our own Christian versions. Just look for the light inside and just follow your heart and all of these things. But it's just moral relativism. No, follow the holiness taught in Scriptures. Moral relativism. We live in a time that's fearful and anxious. Bad news travels so fast. People are holding tightly to a fragile way of life. People live with this perspective like the world's out to get me. We live bombarded by comparison. We live disconnected from the realities of death and different things like that. And we often find ourselves caught up in the system of fear and anxiety rather than differentiated from it. Plugged into social media, plugged into the news, plugged into everybody else's problems, and wondering why we're filled with so much fear and anxiety because we spend more time feeding from these places than we do feeding from the Spirit of God, feeding from the presence of God, feeding from the scriptures of God, feeding from the community of God. And so these things, they take over our lives. We live in a time that is exhausted, a time of burnout, a time where people are struggling to deal with the constant connectedness and demands of life. Life has sped up so fast over the last 100 years, and we have not adapted to it, and so we are languishing in it. There's a sense of weariness within society. There's a blandness or a worn outness. People are tired. We're endlessly entertained, but we're never refreshed. And it's like this exhaustion time. We live in a materialistic time where hope and joy is in stuff, where our obsession with stuff since sort of World War II has just continued to grow and grow and grow. And we treat what we can see and touch as what really matters and all there is. The spiritual and the secular have been removed, and we see things compartmentalized, and we don't have a healthy relationship with materialism. We keep adding, and trust me, this stuff's going somewhere. I'm trying to give us a perspective of what we're trying to live and lead within. We live in an individualistic time where individualism prevails. Individualism is the value for the self over the group. It's where individual freedom, individual choices, individual expressions trump what is best for the group. If what's best for the group and what's best for the person are in conflict in individualism, what's best for the person is what always wins. And that is the prevailing thought in the way people see their lives. It's self, self, and self, and even if it's to the detriment of the group. This is just some of what is going on in this ever-changing world around us. But as well as all of this, we live in a time where the church is finding itself in exile, and people are struggling as the church to adapt to this changing landscape. If you don't realize it or not already, we live in a post-Christian culture, a very post-Christian culture. There was a time where the ethics and the ideas of society more or less aligned with this sort of Judeo-Christian ethic, where there was almost in sickness. I'm not saying we were a Christian nation. I'm just saying there was an alignment between the way people in church and the way people out of church sort of thought about many things in this life. These would be considered traditional views or conservative views by some. But that has changed. The culture is moving, and it's moved. We no longer agree. And honestly, the world couldn't care less what we have to say. The tide has changed, and it's not coming back anytime soon. We live in one of the most secular countries in the Western world. We're on the front edge of this movement. And honestly, I don't think it's a movement worth fighting for. We actually think that God is wanting to teach us what it's like to live as a church in exile. It's not a bad thing. It's okay that this landscape is changing. We don't need to hold on for our political power. We don't need to make everybody think like us. We need to follow Jesus humbly and quietly in the corners of this world that God has given us. We've been told by many Pentecostal preachers over the time that we're the head and not the tail. And that is true, like in the sense of spiritual victory, but it's not our lived experience in the world. And we need to embrace this idea of the suffering servant of Jesus and following his pathway of not being understood, of not being agreed with, of not being on top of the world, of not being in every area of influence. And as much as I aspire for our people to find themselves in that place, we need to be okay with the fact the world is changing and doesn't respect us like perhaps it once did. And I'm not saying it won't change. I'm saying this is some of what's going on in the world around us. People don't see the world through the lens of God and his big story. They don't. They see it through all these other lenses that we've been talking about. And we've got a lot to offer the world, but we need to adapt to being a church in exile. We need to adapt to these changing times. I could go on. We need to adapt because we're facing a generation of Christianity that has not been discipled in the way of Jesus. We've attended church. We have the identity as Christians, but we have through the years been skimming in people's discipleship, and there's no sense of orthodoxy being held by many people who profess Christianity. We've become disciples of individualism, disciples of social justice, disciples of materialism, disciples of exhaustion, disciples of moral relativism, disciples of tribalism, disciples of cynicism, disciples of fear, disciples of anxiety. And we have this perspective of a God who loves us, but we're just trying to fit that God into the things that we've already been discipled in. We've already said what matters to us, and now we want God to fit within that picture. And we have a whole generation of Christianity that has that perspective, and that is a real issue when it comes to leading in these times and following Jesus in these times. People identify with their sexuality before they identify with Jesus. That is the big thing for them. People identify with their race before they identify with Jesus. People identify with their materialistic goals in their world before they are first and foremost a follower of Jesus. And this whole idea of Christians not being discipled or apprenticed in the way of Jesus is making leading and following Jesus difficult and confusing. And then if I add to it, and I don't know if you guys experience this one, but I definitely experienced this one, I find myself in my world and in our community, we can be surrounded by jaded, disenfranchised, and cynical Christians as well. As if it wasn't enough battles to fight out there, we find ourselves with supposed brothers and sisters who are jaded, disenfranchised, and cynical, and are looking to tear down what we're trying to build with God. And that adds to the difficulty of trying to keep a clear head and a clear spirit and a pure heart and trying to stay focused and hear what is happening. There's more ex-Christians sort of than there are Christians as far as people engaging within church life in a healthy way. There's way more of those people like out there that are no longer engaging, if that's sort of making sense what I'm saying. And that's another thing going on. And then if you're just, the final thing is if all of this wasn't enough. So this is a message of hope. As if all of this wasn't enough, is that God is remaking and re-envisioning Curate. And that within all of this, that God is calling us to something different, and he's calling us to something new, and he's calling us to something deeper. He's calling us to the next stage of the journey. There is a thinking change and a model change and a being change that God is calling us into, and I believe it's not just what he wants for us, but it's what he's doing around the world and what he's wanting to call his church at large into this way, and we're just trying to be obedient into following him and leading the church. So we've got all of this going on. We've got all of this stuff in the world. We've got the changing landscape of church. We've got the challenges of discipleship. We've got the jaded Christians around us. And then we have a church trying to like sort of follow the wind of the Spirit and the voice of God as he calls us into what's next for us. And it would be fair to say that leading within all of this isn't always easy. It isn't always easy. It's COVID, it's conspiracies, it's chaos, it's the modern world. And I've been asking this question for a long time. God, what are you doing? God, what are you doing? It's actually in the back of my notebook here in my prayer section. I've just been asking God, what are you doing? I know God's making all things new because that's what God's always doing. And I know that. I know that's the big story of God. That's the big story of hope, that God is making all things new, that he's redeeming everything. But I've been asking God in this time, what are you doing as a part of that story? And a politician asked to meet with me about a year ago, and we had coffee, And he asked me, he said, what do you think is going on in these times? And I honestly had to sit there as he was seeking my advice and go, I honestly have to say, I don't know. I don't know what God is doing in these times. And I went away from that meeting really disappointed because I thought, here's a person, a leader in our nation, take time to seek out me and to sit with me and to ask, what do you think God is doing? And I didn't know the answer. And I had to have my moments with God after that, going, God, I don't want to be a person that doesn't know that answer in my role in life. And so over the last year, I've been trying to slow down, and we've been talking about that and create more space. And every day I've been praying to God, God, what are you doing? And just recently, I felt like God spoke to me, and it wasn't like as amazing as I thought it might be. And so now as I give what I feel like God is doing, it's like, oh, of course he's doing that. But I really felt like God spoke so clearly to me after a year of prayer on this one thing. God is calling his people deeper into his ways. That's what I heard from the Spirit, that God is calling his people deeper into his ways. That's what God is doing, that he's inviting us as people to be with him, to become like him, and to learn to interact with our world in the way he would if he was us. He's asking us to learn to walk with him and to work with him. And as leaders, we have such a pivotal role in times of chaos and COVID and conspiracies to not lose sight of what matters most. God is calling his people deeper into his ways. Many of you would know the story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah was on a mission to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, but there was opposition. There was people who wanted to distract and divide his attention because they didn't want to see the walls go up. They didn't want to see the people flourish, the city flourish. And so Nehemiah, he kept getting badgered and to be distracted. And in Nehemiah 6, verse 2, it says, Sanballat and Geshem sent me this message, come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono. But that should be the sign that you shouldn't go. It's on the plain of Ono. But I've never noticed that. Okay, they were scheming to harm me. So I sent messengers to them with this reply. I am carrying on a great project and I cannot leave. And I cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it to go down to you? 4 times they sent me the same message, and each time I gave them the same answer. And then there's a 5th time, the story goes on to say. And I just think this is such a word for us in this season. Leaders, don't lose what matters most in this time. Don't lose your footing. Don't get distracted. Don't become divisive. Don't get caught up in everything that's going out. Stay in your post like Nehemiah knew to stay in his post. He might have been asked 4 times. He might have been asked 5 times. His reputation was under threat. They were trying to scheme against him, but he kept his hands to the work that was given him. And guys, we have work that is given us. As leaders in the church, our job is to help people walk in the way of Jesus. Our job is not to get caught up in the COVID. Our job is not to get caught up in the conspiracies. Our job is to not get caught up in the vaccinations. Our job is not to get caught up in all of this stuff. And I'm not saying that it doesn't matter. I'm just saying don't lose what matters most. We need to be people who practice the way of Jesus. We need to be people growing in the way of Jesus. And we need to be people leading others in the way of Jesus. Practice the way of Jesus, growing in the way of Jesus, leading others in the way of Jesus. I want our leaders focused in these times on what matters most. I don't want us distracting people. I don't want us getting discouraged by the things going on. Let's hold our post. We need you at your post. Distraction means to have divided thoughts, and so distraction always leads to division, because within its very nature it's divisive. And the church has always had to fight against division and distraction, because the enemy doesn't want the church to flourish. Because when the church flourishes, souls are saved, lives are transformed, generations are transformed, and we cannot leave our post at times like this. I'm afraid many of us, without realizing it, can find ourselves selling our birthright for a stew of a conversation about COVID, for a stew of a conversation about the vaccines. We can find ourselves in a moment where we actually have some people to lead towards Jesus, and we're choosing a lesser conversation, we're choosing a lesser focus, we're choosing a lesser thing to get our heart, and we're spending more time in these things, and rather than flourishing in God, we're being divided by the enemy in these times. Revelation 21 gives this amazing picture of a lake of fire, pretty terrifying, and a holy city, and a river of life that's flowing through the city. And it's just a picture of what the church is supposed to be. All these things we talked about, that's like the lake of fire in this world. And the role of the church isn't to go and sort of like try and put out the fire. The role of the church is to be a holy city with a river of life, so that those whose thirst is quenching amongst the exhausted and fearful and anxious and individualistic and regressive society can come and drink deep of the waters of God in those times. And so I want to say, church, let's practice the way of Jesus. If we go back over all of these things I was talking about, we can see when we live the way of Jesus, when we grow in the way of Jesus, and when we lead others in the way of Jesus, we can see that it is actually the answer to all of these issues. In a regressive society, when we walk the way of Jesus, we partner with God in making all things new. Rather than being reactive, we're responsive. Rather than hurting to the weakest member, we adapt to God and what He is doing in this world. Rather than blame displacement, we take ownership and walk the way of repentance. Rather than a quick fix mentality, we endure and see us flourish on the journey as God takes us from glory to glory. Rather than being sucked into tribalism, the way of Jesus teaches us to love our neighbor as ourselves, and even to love our enemies. This is the way of Jesus. In a culture of loneliness, the way of Jesus teaches us about the practice of covenant community, of living committed and loyal to other believers and being on the journey together. In a culture of victimhood, we learn that actually God has grace for us, and we can feel free to admit our lack inside and take responsibility, because we won't be left on our own, but God will pour His grace into our lives to help us walk through whatever has happened to us in our lives. In a culture obsessed with safety, the way of Jesus calls us to the way of faith and adventure. In a culture of little and no respect for leadership, we're supposed to be a people of honor. Honor up and honor down and honor all around. In a world that is complex, God has wisdom that is like foolishness to this world, that can actually help us navigate what's going on in our lives. In a world that's hyper aware of injustice, the way of Jesus rolls up its sleeves and it serves. In a world of moral relativism, the way of Jesus calls us to holiness. In a world of fearful and anxiety, the way of Jesus gives us peace and hope and trust. In an exhausted society, the way of Jesus calls us to rest. Those that wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. In a materialistic world, the way of Jesus calls us to generosity. In an individualistic world, the way of Jesus calls us to become the least of these and become the servant of all. So as we navigate these times, church, let's be found at our post. As we navigate these times as leaders, let's be found at the post. We're doing a good work. We're doing a good work. We're loving people. We're serving people. We're helping people grow in Jesus. We're feeding people. We're reaching people. And let's trust that through that, God's kingdom becomes manifest to our world. Let's be found at our post. Let's be found at our post. In a moment, we're going to do some questions.